Lovely, so thank you for everyone coming today to our lecture at Yorkshire Natural History Museum. My name is Melissa, I'm the museum coordinator here at the YNHM for the weekends, and I'm currently studying conservation management as my master's degree. So without further ado, we will get started. So today's topic is a temperate rainforest. This has been a bit of a hot topic recently in UK conservation, but not a lot of people are actually aware of this habitat existing. So I thought I'd do a little bit of a presentation to sort of apply general knowledge on the subject. But first of all, what is a temperate rainforest? We've all heard of tropical rainforests. We see them all the time. Fancy holidays, getaways, appeals to protect them from being cut down. But there's been nearly no communication as to what a temperate rainforest actually is, or acknowledgement that they even exist. That's because, at least speaking in British terms, we sort of kind of forgot they were there, which is like, well, how do you forget an entire habitat? So to put it bluntly, a temperate rainforest is a forest where it rains a lot in the temperate regions, and this encourages a different kind of undergrowth and understory to start growing there. And it mainly encourages the growth of epiphytes, which is plants that will actually grow on other plants. You've got things like mosses and lichens and lungworts as well. So typically, there's many names in the UK. We've got upland oakwoods, Atlantic rainforest, Atlantic oakwoods, Western oakwoods, Caledonian and Celtic rainforests as well. And so because there's many different regions with different names, we sort of didn't recognise them as all being the same thing. And because there's no different species variation, at least in terms of the trees here, they're still oaks, they're still pines, they're still ashes, they're all native species of trees, we didn't see them as a distinct habitat until recently. So talking here, we've got the different zones of the actual planet here. The tropical climates have the majority of rainforest within them because the temperate climates are a little bit further north past the desert regions just here. And crucially, to get enough rainfall in the temperate zones, they have to be an oceanic climate in the country to grow these rainforests. So simply put, moisture-laden air will roll in from the ocean. It will then be pushed upwards once it reaches the land, cool and condense and form heavy rain clouds. So the average definition, at least for the American terms, is annual precipitation has to be over 55 inches and with an average temperature between 4 and 12 degrees Celsius to count as a temperate rainforest. They use the abiotic or the physical environmental factors to determine the habitat. So I've got my tape measure here. So if we measure out 55 inches, here we go. And just about there. So that's as much rainfall as needs to be qualified for an American temperate rainforest, just there. Now, that does vary. Of course, rainfall varies per year. So it's not, I would say, an accurate measurement. You'll then develop, depending on levels of fog, especially in the Pacific Northwest, rainfall fluctuations. Of course, there's been drought in some areas. So it's not a surefire way of defining the habitat. The Australian version, because Australia and New Zealand have Australia's nearly entirely temperate rainforest and got a little pocket down here in southern Australia. The Australian conditions depend more on current ecological structure, so looking at the structure of the forests within themselves. So the canopy layer has to be blocking 75% of the sky is one of the factors for Australian temperate rainforests. They've also got to have tree species that don't depend on fire to spread their seeds, which is obviously not something we have to be concerned about in the UK. We don't have species that depend on fire like they do in Australia, so that one doesn't quite match our definition. So we've actually recognised those places as having temperate rainforests before Britain because they were largely untouched by the time European settlers recognised those environments. Or not untouched, but managed in native peoples in such a way as to be visually distinct from British rainforests. So the British definition is a lot looser. It's simply a forest so damp that plants grow on other plants. And you're then thinking, how can a plant grow inside of another plant? That sounds ridiculous. The plant in question is called polypody ferns, and a temperate rainforest is actually one of the rarest habitats on Earth currently, simply due to its geographical extent. So you've got your world map just here. Temperate rainforest will only cover about 3% of that. So you've got your Pacific Northwest right at the top. That's your great redwood trees, your forests. They've got the Appalachian Range as well in the east of the Americas, the Vivaldian Range in South America, You've got Britain with a lot of temperate rainforest location in Britain, through the Middle East, through to Japan and Eastern Korea and China, and then New Zealand, which is just the entirety of New Zealand counts as temperate rainforest habitat, which is really, really cool. Yeah. But around 20% of Britain actually has the suitable climate for temperate rainforests. So we get enough rain. And so the example of the American one was 55 inches. Everyone knows Britain is a rainy, rainy island. There are areas of Britain that actually get nearly 2 meters of rainfall a year. So to put that in perspective, I will just keep going. Yeah, nope. This won't be showing up well on camera, but it's still going to be around about, yeah, it reaches the ceiling and I can't even extend it past, it goes down further than the table. That's how much rain we get a year. So it's really no wonder we get a forest based on rain in our current environment. So it's crucially, this is areas where we get high rainfall. This is the hydro map. And it's also areas where, because they're close to the sea, they don't get a lot of variation in their temperatures year round, no more than 10 degrees variation, which is really good because forests contain, they sort of infect their current environment. They make it a bit more stable in terms of temperature fluctuations. If you're out on a field on a sunny day and a winter day, you will find that the field is hotter in summer and colder in winter than a forest in the same region. It might literally be in a different, just across the road. The forest will have less temperature fluctuation. It forms a microclimate and sort of temperature controls itself. So there we have there. So this is the potential land, and the land that historically has been covered in temperate rainforest, about 20% of Great Britain as a whole. Currently, it's now 0.5% of the British Isles after 8,000 years of land use. Now, I say land use completely neutrally because we as a species have been living in Great Britain consistently for about 9,000 years, ever since we were separated from Europe. We have always used our land for farming, for wood, for building houses, for just basically living amongst ourselves. It's only recently that the extent of deforestation has actually been noted in terms of temperate rainforests. So these are some of the current protected rainforests you can go and see with the Woodland Trust. I really recommend it. They're lovely places to go. And I've got several of these on my bucket list, actually, especially the Scottish ones. Yeah. So in terms of what you can actually find in a temperate rainforest, what makes them special? So we find a very high percentage of liverworts. So they look like tiny palm trees, so I really like them. But liverworts are among some of the oldest plants in the kingdom. They're about 400 million years old. These would have been some of the first things to assist in colonising the land just around the Devonian period. So they've been here a very, very long time. These things predate trees. They predate, we're talking older than 400 million years. They predate birth of the North Star. They predate the rings of Saturn. So these things are really, really old, and they depend on the moist and temperature-controlled areas of the temperate rainforests. You have hazelwood fungus, I believe. Yep, this is a protected species of fungus in the UK. It's incredibly rare, and it only grows in areas of temperate rainforest that are sufficiently damp and sufficiently with clean air enough. So there's a really rare type of fungus we have just there. Lichens depend on clean air massively. Lichens are sort of a marriage between plants and fungus to actually form a partnership. So lichens are extremophiles. So if you go to Antarctica, you have the dry valleys there. It hasn't rained in 2,000 years in the dry valleys. You call the Sahara dry. That's literally the least dry than Sahara. You will still find lichens living there. They've sent lichens to space. They're that extreme of a tolerance. But lichens do like it a little bit easier sometimes, and temperate rainforests, a lot of the time with clean air being in the west of the country where there's less industrialisation, actually thrive in that sort of environment, and they can be absolutely festooned with lichens and mosses that you can't actually see the tree in some instances, just covered in them. Polypody ferns, as I've said, so these are the kinds of ferns that will literally find a nice bed of moss on a branch and go, I would like to put down roots here and grow into a plant of my own accord. That is literally their modus operandi. That's how they live. And these are the defining feature. If you think you're in a UK temperate rainforest, you're looking for these ferns. They will be a really good indicator as to where you might find yourself. You also have things like old man's beard lichen, which is, again, it's still a lichen. I know it looks completely different. There's many thousands of different species. I like it because if you've watched Lord of the Rings, the 2000 films, they use this stuff as the actual tree beard's beard for many of the ents here. It's really lovely, really spooky, And talk about people not knowing this kind of environment existed. I thought this only existed in Scooby-Doo cartoons when they go into the swamps and they do some kind of spooky American Gothic thing. I didn't realize we had this here. So there's a really large disconnect between the actual environment we live in and the environment we're perceiving. But you can absolutely find these all over the trees there. And of course, in terms of animals, you find a lot of rare ones as well. So this is a pied flycatcher. So the kind of birds that would thrive in this environment, we have a really close canopy with temperate rainforest. These birds are only for short form flight. They flit between trees. They're not doing long sustained flights across moorland or farmland or anything like that. So they really depend on the close cover. And they're also eating several insects that would only live in the canopy level of such a forest. So you basically won't see them outside of the temperate rainforests or areas just adjacent to them. So it's why it's important we protect these areas. Yeah. Now, what we have here are biophytes. So hazel gloves fungus, there we go, that's the correct name for this one. So it's a priority species under the Biodiversity Action Plan, and it's on the biodiversity lists for the country. Polypody ferns are actually critically endangered under the ICUN Red List, so they are protected species that we should be watching out for. But because they're so, I don't want to say that we don't value them because they're here, but there's been a trend in conservation and restoration to look at exotic locations, a trend to go and save the Amazon rainforest or to go and save, the savanna over in Kenya and things like that. And I think it does our local environments a disservice to not look at what we're actually living right next to because we assume it's boring because we know what's here when actually a lot of people have no clue what's here. And we have endangered species right under our feet. We actually have some nearby, not far from here, not far from Sheffield where we're doing this presentation. Can't remember the name of the valley for the life of me, but we do have some relatively nearby. And of course, 1/5 of biophytes are actually at risk of extinction, which is a lovely doom and gloom comment to have on the presentation. Don't worry, it's more positive later. Don't worry, I promise it's not a doom and gloom scenario. Right, so talking a bit more about the actual trees we have here. So the actual typical environment of a UK temperate rainforest is very spooky. It's very twisted. The trees typically don't grow straight. They grow incredibly crooked. And of course, we have a 95% coverage of the sky and 95% shade in summer. So it's dark, it's misty, it's wet. It's very much like a Lord of the Rings set, and especially when you go into Dartmoor and places like that. But the reason the trees are this crooked is simply because the land that currently supports the temperate rainforests is often sheer, it's often covered in boulders, the soil's not very good, and it's got no other use, which is important. Humans have gone onto all the nice smooth hills and the nice fertile valleys and gone, okay, we'll clear some trees and we'll set up a village, we'll set up farmland, we'll set up X, Y, and Z. This land had no use except maybe potentially sheep grazing, and even then it's like we've got better fields to put the sheep in. So by sheer virtue of not being useful to us, these are the only areas that survive, which makes it a bit of a problem in IDing temperate rainforests where trees don't look like this. So the trees here are crooked because they've got heavy winds to compete with. It's cold, the land isn't level, so the roots are having to do some extreme balancing to keep the trees upright. And they're also competing against each other for light. Whereas in areas like Loch Lomond in Scotland, which is actually an area where the trees go straight, so they wouldn't match these trees here, but they would critically have the same coverage of moss. So it's a survivorship bias almost. We think temperate rainforest should look like something out of Scooby-Doo, when in fact that's just the parts that actually survive due to our own incidental management of the landscape. Yeah. But it's the same sort of stuff. It's all oak, ash, pine, birch, critically hazel. Hazel trees have a very special place in temperate rainforests as well, and linked to the hazel dormouse, which is on the endangered list for UK species as well, which is why we need more hazel in hedgerows, basically, just to help that species branch out a little bit. Yeah. But one critical favourite part that I have in terms of temperate forest restoration is the existence of ghost woods, and that's not an official term, but I heard it once and couldn't let it go, so that's what I'm calling them. So basically, because the wider climate of the UK hasn't shifted dramatically, areas that once supported temperate rainforest can still support temperate. It's often the first thing to come back and would indicate potentially an older seed bank that might show a temperate rainforest's previous range before being cut down. So you can see you've got Wistman's Wood here in northern England. The green areas is where the current temperate rainforest is. The brown areas are where the bracken is. It's all within a sort of a deeper ravine sort of area, a bit more sheltered from the wind. The bracken is indicating the potential natural range of the wood if left to its own devices. And if you took the grazers out of there for 60 to 100 years, I think you'd find the trees would start to naturally succeed their way through the landscape back to their original range. So it's sort of basically detective work in the landscape to see where things used to be and where they will likely first return to if environmental conditions remain similar. Yeah. So speaking of succession, so just a quick overview of that. So basically, the UK doesn't get total devastation often, not like a new volcanic island emerging out of the sea where there's no previous seed bank, and that is a longer, slower primary succession where you need birds to drop seeds and fungus and lichens to develop soil and mosses and things like that. We often have secondary succession. So you've had a pre-existing habitat, and for whatever reason, it has been cleared or destroyed, likely in terms of you've made a farmland or you've built a housing estate. That's what we're looking at in the United Kingdom, or you've paved over it and made a car park. Succession just describes the way the landscape will slowly return to a climax habitat, which is where it can sustain itself naturally and will stop evolving just here. So first to come back is always mosses. You've all seen moss-covered paveways. That's the first thing to come back in Britain. Mosses actually create soil. Then you have tough grasses. Everyone's had dandelions pop up in the front yard. That's the first sign of succession, nature trying to return to it. Very hardy, very tough species these are. Grasses come back in, perennials come back in, poppies, flowers, wildflowers, things like that. After that comes shrubs. We've all seen bramble. We all know how much of a faff it is to deal with and how horrible it is once you get a big snarl of bramble to cut it back. Bramble's essential in the succession record because it shelters smaller plants growing through underneath it. I think in the Midlands, bracken is also known as the cradle of oak. So you've got a big grassland, you've got areas of bramble and raspberry, blackberry, things like that. You'll often find oak and other big established tree saplings growing out of the middle of that. They're protecting the seed from being grazed by deer and things like that. It's a nice little association between the two layers. And then, of course, you've got your first pioneer species coming across in the trees. So pioneer species in Britain tend to be species that don't live very long compared to other trees. An oak can live for potentially 1,000 years. A birch will live for maybe 100 years, simply due to the differences in preferred environments. Birches and willows are the first ones to fling themselves off and go, I'm going to try over there. And in doing so, they sort of change the climate. They sort of slow down rates of evaporation and transition. They keep water in the area. They bring a bit of shade in. And then slower trees that take much longer to establish but are very present and will last a long time sort of follow in their footsteps. So a forest will quite literally walk its way across a landscape following the birches. In areas that are wet, this also applies to willows as well. It's fascinating. If you watch a riverbed dry up, you can first see willows, then birches, then ash trees, then eventually oaks and big pines are often the last thing to come in. So it's a really fascinating process to watch. So if you were to take all of the deer and sheep out of a landscape, which would be around this area, or maybe just here if it's particularly bad, for temperate rainforests, you'd find that succession comes actually within 60 to 100 years, at least for the initial pioneer species, and then the older species start to come and re-establish themselves. But it's very important that once you have a climax environment, you leave it for as long as possible. There are some species, I mean, for example, if you cut down a mature oak of 500 years, there's going to be several thousand species living on that single oak that can only live on an oak of 500 years old. Once you cut that down, it's gone. It can't just move to a different tree. So these are preserving an environment that quite literally, you've got small insects, plenty of fungi, thousands of fungi, small birds, things like that will only live in the microclimates provided by mature veteran trees. So even if you're allowing the forest to expand to its former range, it will still take centuries to return to its former glory, which makes the ancient remnants so very, very important. But in terms of actual threats to the current one, people say, okay, yeah, you've mentioned, farming, you've mentioned housing, you've mentioned these sort of things, but, what does that mean in terms of how is that a threat? Because, we're not going to stop building houses for ourselves. We're not going to stop growing food. It's just a case of looking at how those threats intersect into forming the worst case scenario for these types of rainforests. So you've got overgrazing. We've all seen sheep. I have a very tense personal history with sheep. I don't particularly like them for reasons I won't go into here. And we also have a deer problem in the United Kingdom. So we have currently 6 species of deer roaming the island. Only 2 of those are actually native. Others have been imported from zoos or private collections that have escaped. So Chinese water deer, sika deer are all actually invasive species. the red and roe deer that we have are native, but even then, everyone knows Britain's a safe country because we've gotten rid of all of our natural large-scale predators. There's no more bears here, there's no more wildcats, there's no more wolves. And these were the primary controlling factors for grazing herbivores on the island. And without them, the deer have gone, whoa, we are completely safe, aside from, the odd, human-induced intervention. We'll just breed like crazy. A herd of 1,000 deer can become 10,000 deer within 10 years. So it's a problem. And you might think, oh, they're cute, they're fluffy. Why would you on earth would you hurt such a lovely animal? And I will fully agree with that. But what you don't realize is these things will absolutely strip a landscape if they're confined to it. They will chew it down to literally almost the bare dirt and then will move elsewhere. And this is terrible ecologically for everything else going on in the surrounding area. Sheep will do much the same. Sheep chew everything down to a short, tough turf. The green rolling fields we're so used to. That's the descriptive feature of our landscape. That is sheep turf. And it's a problem in terms of if you let these animals into an area where temperate rainforest is trying to re-establish, especially the deer, they'll just chew down on all the new saplings and be on their way. It can get very difficult. Of course, we've got deforestation. Historically, this has been for farmland, for timber. Even in the late 20th century, the UK government was still planting very, very poorly planned, I will say, plantations of invasive pines from Norway, which, they'll grow great straight timber and you can cut them down in 40 years, but they're basically ecologically dead. Almost nothing can live in the intense shade provided by these conifers, and they are shading out the temperate rainforest that should be thriving here. And then I'll add to that as well, housing developments. There's actually, they've just brought into law the Biodiversity Net Gain Act, which is really important and really good. Basically, having that whenever you build something new in the UK, especially a housing estate, you have to take measures to ensure biodiversity in the area, plants and animals, is actively improved once construction is finished. That might be building ponds, it might be planting trees, it might be establishing a wildflower meadow. It's a really lovely bit of law that's been brought in that I'm really appreciative of. You've also got the current issue with ash dieback, a fungal infection that's just killing swathes of ash trees across the country. We had this with elm not long since as well. Of course, if you're looking at the 5 major species of temperate rainforest, that's one of the major players immediately taken out because the ash trees are just becoming hollow and falling apart. So, a bit of an issue controlling that one there. And you've also got, on the human side, unclear and contested laws on land ownership and use, which is a real problem in rural areas. So people are arguing over whose land it is, what you can do to it, who belongs in it, and things can get so caught up in paperwork. We're a very bureaucratic country. It literally takes sometimes 20 years to sort it out, and by that point, you've left it a long, long time and things have either been lost opportunities or been damaged. All of that contributes to being a highly fractured environment. And that's really bad because if you've got pockets of rainforest and pockets of any habitat really, and the animals within cannot move to those new areas, you're looking at inbreeding, genetic lack of diversity, and increased vulnerability to diseases, and basically the slow die-off of an environment that while there might be lots percentage-wise covered, they're not connected, not operating as a full environment should. So you've got to ensure there's corridors where wildlife, trees and plants can both move and expand seeds and have environments where they can become a bit more genetically resilient. So people are like, okay, well, the issue with temperate rainforest is a lack of trees. Why can't we not just plant more trees? And this, while an excellent thing and a great community building exercise to go and plant more trees, personally, I have a bit of an addendum or an issue with it. So you're more than happy to go and plonk 10,000 trees onto an exposed hillside. But of those 10,000, you might only get 50 to 100 that actually take root and become new trees. And that's because if I quickly go back to succession, here we are. You can't go from grass and just tough dirt straight to a climax environment. You're missing the essential steps being created just here. So this allows for carbon cycling and locking. It allows for an increase in the depth and the nutrition of soil. And also, going back to what I said about trees and shrubs having a bit of climate control, they create and keep moisture around the base of the tree. It's cooler, it's more shaded, it's by the roots. You can't plonk an oak tree sapling into the middle of an open field with no protection because it's too hot, it's too dry. The sapling doesn't like it. And so the sapling will likely die. And that makes spending lots and lots of money on vast areas of just straight tree planting a little bit of a waste, in my opinion. You would get similar results if you just left the land alone and let a local tree bank of trees just move their saplings in, let the land succeed from grass to scrub to forest, and you will have a much better and cheaper effect because the environment will be self-sustaining by that point. But obviously, people don't want to not take action, so it's a matter of planting the right species in the right places, so you're minimizing the lack of trees that just die within the first year, essentially. That's my little bit about proper practice there. And also these plastic tree guards, they're deer guards, so you need them to stop the deer from chewing them down to nothing, but also there's a really good chance they increase mold and, fungal infection for the tree. So it's pros and cons. It's what you can afford funding-wise, community-wise, and also just what's best for the land. So always make sure you're looking at what's the best sort of tree to put in what place here, if you're not going to be able to let the land naturally succeed through scrubland first. But I'm not going to leave it on a dour note. There's been loads of success stories when it comes, especially recently, to temperate rainforest in the UK, as it's now a recognised environment. There's been loads of money actually put into it. You've actually got one area up in Cornwall. So there's an area they're tripling the size of temperate rainforest. Actually, Wistman's Wood doubled in size over 20 years just because the farmers naturally, when they've got better fields over there, will move the sheep. And no one realised it, but the forest grew massively in that 20 years because they left it alone and it succeeded itself. So the environment just healing it just by accident. Then you've got the RSPB Housewater working with United Utilities to sort of change up the grazing procedure. You can still graze. I'm not saying don't take the sheep out completely. Just switch it up with cattle and different horses and ponies, maybe pigs. They all graze at different heights and different lengths and different species. So as long as you change it up, nothing actually gets completely cut back. And it's a very important part to actually keep grazing in our landscape. We've maintained Britain for 8,000 years on sheep and cattle. It's important we keep maintaining that. But yeah, so we've got to collect native seeds, actually begin to plant them so they've got the same genetic resistances as the trees next to them. Oxygen conservation down at the bottom just there. One of the country's last remaining large-scale temperate rainforests at Leighton Estate in Dartmoor. Dartmoor's excellent for it. I do recommend going to Dartmoor to have a look at these beautiful landscapes. It's really spectacular. People are starting to now actually partner and plan to protect the environment and these landscapes, which is really, really nice to see. But that is, I believe, the end of my presentation. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will be taking any questions. Thank you. A lot of information.